Okay, so now we're going to talk about the press and the government. Obviously, the most important consideration is going to be the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which protects a free press. So there's only so much regulation of the media that the government can do. By and large, the press, the media, in the United States is perhaps the freest in the world. This is not to say that there aren't some regulations, but in general, the media is free to criticize government officials and government policies and to relay information to citizens with virtually no government interference. There is a difference between electronic media, such as broadcast radio, broadcast TV, satellite communications, as compared to print media, newspapers and magazines. Newspapers and magazines are treated one way because one person publishing a newspaper in no way impacts another person's ability to publish a newspaper in the same location. But with electronic communication, this isn't the case. One person operating a radio station or a television station in an area, broadcasting on the airwaves, definitely does impact someone's ability to do it. There's only so many spots on the electromagnetic spectrum that can accommodate broadcast signals. If two stations in the same area try to broadcast on the same frequency, neither one gets through. So the airwaves are deemed to be public property, and in exchange for getting a license to use the public airwaves, these media outlets, broadcast radio, broadcast TV, agree to certain regulations. So we regulate the electronic media a little bit more than what we do with the print media. The federal entity that regulates electronic media is the Federal Communications Commission, FCC. And we're going to talk a little bit more about its structure as an independent regulatory commission whenever we talk about the bureaucracy. But sufficient for right now, that is the federal government's agency, the federal government agency that is responsible for regulating electronic media, primarily broadcast TV and broadcast radio. There's some relevant Supreme Court cases to think about when we talk about the First Amendment and its meaning and how it relates to the press. The first is Neer versus Minnesota. The significance of Neer versus Minnesota is that it makes it very difficult for the government to engage in a practice known as prior restraint. Prior restraint is the government's ability to stop the publication or stop the broadcast of something in advance of the actual publication date or broadcast date. As such, it is censorship. So with the case of Neer versus Minnesota, the government can engage in prior restraint only if the broadcast would contain crucial military information, if it would be obscene, or if it would lead to violence. And those are the only three instances in which the government would be allowed under the interpretation of the First Amendment in this case to engage in prior restraint. So as a general rule, the government cannot stop the publication of something before it happens. The next one is New York Times versus United States, sometimes referred to as the Pentagon Papers case. And this is another example of the government trying to engage in prior restraint. The significance of New York Times versus Sullivan is that it reaffirms some of the decisions that were made in Neer versus Minnesota. The decision was actually a per curiam decision, which means it's kind of questionable for its precedential value, but it's still worthy of note that in this instance, the Supreme Court of the United States upheld the right of the New York Times newspaper to publish information that the national government wanted to keep secret. Next case is Miller versus California. Miller versus California is the Supreme Court case that allows us to have some sort of test to determine whether some material is obscene. If you'll recall, again, from our discussions on civil liberties, that not all sexually oriented material is prohibited, but only sexually oriented material that is obscene can be prohibited. So we have to have a way to determine what is obscene and what is not. So the court gives us a three-part test to help us figure out what is obscene and what is not. The specifics of that test, I'll rely upon you to review the material presented in the Civil Liberties lecture. A rule that is enforced upon broadcast journalists is the equal time rule. The equal time rule requires that if a broadcast radio or broadcast TV station makes available or sells airtime to a candidate for public office, they must do so for that candidate's opponent, and must do so at a similar rate and during similar time slots. This doesn't obligate the second candidate to actually take it. Perhaps the candidate doesn't want to, and that's fine, but the station must absolutely make it available, make that slot available at a similar time. The station could also say, we don't take political advertising. That's acceptable as well. But if you have a license to broadcast TV or radio, then you must make your airtime available on an equal basis to competing candidates for the same political office. Another rule that's not necessarily enforced anymore is the Fairness Doctrine. The Fairness Doctrine was a prior policy that required broadcast radio and broadcast TV to present information and programming to the public in a balanced manner. This is to say that if a television station presented one side of a story or one particular viewpoint, it would be obligated to give comparable time to some other viewpoint as well. So it couldn't just pick and choose. It couldn't just focus on liberals versus conservatives or Democrats versus Republicans. It would have to provide balanced coverage. The Fairness Doctrine was eliminated in the 1980s and is no longer in force, although some stations do adhere to it on a voluntary basis. It should be noted that if the Fairness Doctrine was still in force, talk radio probably would not be as popular as it is. The right wing of the American political spectrum has definitely dominated talk radio. The liberals tried to have talk radio, but it wasn't commercially viable. The network was called Air America, and it never really went anywhere. So if the Fairness Doctrine were to be reinstituted, those stations would have to provide both liberal and conservative viewpoints, and that would probably drive down their ratings. Next, we want to talk about bias in the media. The media is frequently accused of being biased, usually to a liberal viewpoint, although there are some, particularly on the East and West Coast, that accuse the media of being conservative, dominated by corporate interests. So let's take a look at it. The political ideology of most reporters, it's pretty well documented, is liberal in nature. Most reporters have gone to a state school. They have a liberal political bias, will typically vote for Democrats, and have all typically majored in journalism. This can be contrasted with the political ideology of the owners of these various media outlets. Most of the owners of media outlets, or definitely the managers of media outlets, tend to be conservative in nature. They're interested in corporate profits. They also tend to be more affluent. They tend to vote Republican, and they tend to be definitely economically conservative. So there is a thought process that the balance or the interaction between these two ends up balancing it out. Now, many people will still perceive the media as being liberally biased, but for this to be true, or for a more accurate representation, that individual who's making the assertion must take into account their own bias. Someone who is very conservative would perceive a moderately biased media as being liberal. For that matter, someone who is very liberal would perceive a media with a moderate bias, a centrist media, as being conservative biased. Perhaps the biggest bias in the media is the bias of profit. The fact that the media is a business dictates what stories are advanced to the forefront, or that are selected for broadcast or publication. Stories that may be important for citizens to know in terms of regulating their government may not make it if the news editors don't believe that they are commercially viable. Next, we want to consider narrowcasting, or the echo chamber. Narrowcasting is the phenomenon, as I previously mentioned, that with the rise of cable TV, the new business model was to only appeal to a narrow segment of the population, and to get those individuals locked in by presenting to those individuals media that had the particular bias that those individuals found preferable. So we see this with Fox first, where they took on a liberal slant and tried to lock in that segment of the marketplace. And you also see it with MSNBC, who makes no bones about being liberal now. So this narrowcasting leads to something that we call the echo chamber, in which individuals begin to not be exposed to positions that are contrary to their own. back in the heyday of broadcast TV, both liberals and conservatives alike would watch the same television broadcast and would have points of view that would challenge their own understanding or their own worldview. With the advent of narrowcasting, which is allowed by the growth of cable TV, those same type individuals now can exist without ever hearing someone of a different point of view.